Ladies and gentlemen, you're in my CSI room. You're at my ranch in Mount Calm, Texas. This is an ordinary shotgun used by a lot of hunters around the country, except it played a very important part in a murder case that was ruled originally a suicide. Now, the man who was killed put on the sesquicentennial ride from Texas. It was actually the 100-year celebration from Texas to Washington and back. Now, his name was Glenn Corson. Mr. Corson was known all over the industry, had his own gun shop, and a well-known person who really cared. Police officers catered to him and everything else. A number of years ago, though, when I was called, I was told that Glenn had committed suicide. I was out of town, arrived on Friday, and the funeral was to be scheduled on Monday. His two brothers, one of which was a Dallas police officer, called me and said, "Bill, I don't think it was a suicide, but that's the way they've ruled it." So I got a chance to go to see the gun before the funeral. And I looked at the gun that had been found at the crime scene in Irving, Texas, just behind his place of business. I attended the funeral, and this is what I did. By looking at the gun and looking at the crime scene photos that I'd been given the opportunity to look at, I thought this was more of a homicide than it was a suicide, and I also thought it was a quick rush to judgment by the police department. Now remember, most suicides are just what they are, but they're always one of those that is not a suicide. In this particular case, what drew my attention to it was the fact that I saw a picture of the gun laying in the position that the officer said he found it. By examining several of the photographs, I noticed something very particular that stood out in my mind, especially after all the years in the field of homicide. And what it was is that the shotgun was in a locked position. They claimed that he picked up the gun, pulled it like this up against his chest, and pulled the trigger and slung the gun. First of all, slinging a gun after you've just had your heart broken by a lot of buckshot, it can't happen. But what was more important is, on this particular model gun, the breech block opened and stayed open. But when I found it, in that photograph, the breech block was locked and closed, which means that someone picked up the gun, ejected the shell, and laid it back down in the position and got their butt chewed out because they had done something wrong. They had actually done a lot of things wrong. But in this particular case, because of that, they were ruling this thing a suicide. I went to the funeral. I'd known Mr. Corson for a long period of time. I knew his brothers. I knew all the family, and I cared. So when the funeral was over, without a lot of people knowing anything about it, and the body went down with the casket into the ground, I had a hearse standing by. I pushed a button and brought the body back up. I then had it taken back from the gurney, loaded into the hearse, and took it right there in Irving, Texas, to the same mortuary where the funeral had been held. I had called in a lady by the name of Dr. Marilyn Siblin. She and I took the body out of the casket with the help of the mortician and the people at the funeral home and re-examined the body from one end to the other. It wasn't long after that that we were able to determine that Glenn Corson did not commit suicide, but was murdered. And the law enforcement people had made a serious mistake. Things like that can happen. And what it does, it affects a lot of people. First of all, the insurance company does not pay off on suicide in most cases. In this particular case, we had a reputation of a man who was very important. Yes, he was having financial trouble. Yes, he'd put a lot of money into this 100-year sesquicentennial ride back and forth. But he was also a man who could get up and make a dollar if he had to. In this particular case, what had happened is that the vehicle that he had the generator on was placed in the back of his place of business in the alley. When I reconstructed, I found where the bullet marks from the pellets had struck the pattern on the brick wall. I could then attribute that what Mr. Corson did was because we found somebody who had spoke to Mr. Corson a few minutes prior to his alleged suicide. And this is what they said. When I talked to Glenn, I was in general conversation. All of a sudden he said, "Oh, mate, there they are again. It's the same two guys I saw earlier. I'm going to go see what's going on." he never got a call back. And this was a Smith & Wesson representative. But yet, the next time they found Glenn Corson, he was laying by the bed of his truck in the alleyway, and the gun was laying there in a closed and locked position. We know who committed the murder. And we still do. And has it come to a trial? Not yet. But it will one of these days real soon. And why? Because of the fact an officer picked up the gun when he was not supposed to and ejected the shell casing and laid the gun down in a closed and locked position. So just remember, when you're looking and reading about cases, it's not always exactly the way it's said in the paper or in magazines or in books. A suicide can, in fact, be a murder. And my crime scene room here at my ranch in Mount Calm speaks for itself. In a previous segment, we talked about a case where it was ruled a suicide, but it was really a murder. In this particular case, this is a .410 single-shot shotgun. It's really called a Snake Charmer 2. One shot, as you can see, and it's done really to kill snakes. But in this particular case, a lady put it in her mouth and pulled the trigger. I was doing a radio show for KRLD television and radio, and this is what happened. I always took questions from the audience or people who would call in. In this particular case, I will only call her Ann, called, and she was very depressed. And so as a result of that, we could tell that I had a doctor on staff who would review some of the callers. He told me that he felt that she might be possibly suicidal. I made arrangements to meet with her and talk to her and told her I'd like to profile her on my show because, see, at a younger age, she was a rape victim. Now she was in her early 30s and still suffering major depression. She lived alone and had her cat. She had her goldfish, but that's all she had. And she worked for a major insurance company. I got to know Ann pretty well, and I did, in fact, profile her on my radio show. Within a couple of weeks, several people called her and spoke to her and let her know that if she needed them, please call. And I thanked my audience because that's the kind of audience I had at KRLD. It was going all over the state of Texas and to some of the other states outlying Texas. And as a result of that, I thought, okay, I've made a big help in helping Ann. But she called me for 2 weeks, and then on the third week, she didn't call that weekend. And I always did the show on Sunday nights. And she'd call up and say, thank you, Bill. But she didn't call. For some reason, I didn't check it that day when I got back. And I found on Monday morning there was a note. And the note indicated to me that she was going to commit suicide. I took it very seriously. I went to her place where she lived and found that she was okay. And she apologized for the note. But I felt I needed to be concerned. 2 weeks later, again, she didn't call me on a Sunday. On Monday morning, I received another note. And this time, I was really worried. I took another investigator with me, went to the door, and there was a note. And it was addressed to me, Bill. I opened it, and inside was a key. And it said, forgive me, Bill. I know you tried to help. I opened the door, and there Ann was laying in her bed with the shotgun still in her mouth where she had pulled the trigger. Again, this was a real suicide. If you know anybody that suffers like that, try and help them. I don't want them to be a victim. And you who are watching this segment, keep in mind, it could be your mother, your daughter, your sister, your brother, could even be you. But when you see a case, remember there's always an underlying circumstance involving the person's death. Sometimes murder, sometimes suicide. But in this case, it was a suicide.